Gesels vanoggend met Brian van Wilgen en hy is 'n emeritus professor by die Senter vir Innovasie Biologie verbonde aan die Universiteit Stellenbosch. Nou ons gaan 'n bietjie praat oor wetenskaplikes wat een van Afrika se mees vernietigende indringerbome takel. Professor, welcome to GROOTplaas. It's such an honor having you here.
Good morning.
Good morning. I hope you are having a good morning so far.
I am. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Let's talk about this. We're talking about precipice trees. Now, where do they come from and how did they get to Africa? Can you give us a bit of history about these trees?
Precipice trees are from Central America, from Mexico and down the Isthmus of Panama. That's where they originally come from.
Yes.
And they were imported to Africa for the so-called advantages that they give. Now, people were concerned in parts of Africa about droughts and desertification, and this tree would be, something that you could use to combat those problems. And so they were promoted by governments and by so-called aid agencies and also by NGOs, actively planted over wide areas. And so they've been imported to many African countries, South Africa, Namibia, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, and so on. And they've also been imported into Asia. They're very problematic in India and also in Australia.
Yeah. Well, when we look at their impact, because obviously there's a bit of a negative impact they are having, what is this specifically and what are they used for?
Well, the reason they were brought here was they have multiple uses. So they have pods on them that cattle can eat, and goats and sheep. They would provide shade for animals. They would provide a source of firewood, and they could be used for erosion control. So it sounded like a wonderful idea. Let's bring this tree in and bring it in, but they became invasive. So they form really dense thickets, and they have a very bad impact on water resources. So wells will dry up, groundwater levels will drop. They crowd out all of the grasses that cattle need to eat, and so there's no grass for them to eat, and they can't get into those grassy areas anyway.
Yeah.
They impact negatively on biodiversity. All of our native species are crowded out, and they cause a lot of injuries. They have thorns on them, so people get injured, livestock get injured, and they produce a lot of pollen, so people are allergic to them.
Yeah. They
even increase the number of malaria-spreading mosquitoes in a particular area.
Oh, goodness, really?
No, so overall, they're bad news.
I'm quite interested. How do they spread? How does that process work?
Well, in two ways, three maybe. First of all, cattle eat the pods, and then they spread them with their dung as they wander around. So the seeds will germinate all over the place, and then they spread episodically when there's a high rainfall. So if you have these dry rivers in these areas which only flood once every 5 or 6 years, but when they do, they carry the seeds down the river and they spread very rapidly in these bursts every time there's a flood. And then, of course, people spread them.
Yes.
People say, oh, we want to pick up a few seeds and plant them in our area, and they get around, they travel large distances that way.
Yeah. Now, I also know that you recently published a book on these trees. What was your frame thought about on why you're doing this, but also what is the impact that you want your book to have?
Well, let me start with the project that we ran. It was funded by the Swiss government, and it ran for 10 years. And there's very little information on invasion ecology in the rest of Africa. There was a recent study that was done in Europe that looked at all of the work that had been done on invasion ecology around the world. And only 3.5% of the studies were carried out in Africa. And of that 3.5%, 2/3 of it came from one country, and that was South Africa. So you can see there's very little information for people to go on. They need to know how the ecology of these species work.
Yeah.
They need to know how to manage them and so on. The prosopis trees have already invaded about 10 million hectares in Eastern Africa. But if you don't do something about the problem, we've estimated that they are going to cover 3/4 of Kenya, and about half of Ethiopia, and about 1/3 of Tanzania. So that's going to be an enormous problem, and it needs to be dealt with.
How do you approach your studies and your research?
Well, this was a very interesting project. As I say, it lasted for 10 years. Now, what you find, if you want to go into an area and find out what is known about a particular issue, then you'll find that there are a few studies scattered around, but they were maybe done in different places. They were done at different times. They were done at different scales. So when you try to put the picture together, you have this problem of the things don't match. So what we did with our students, we had about 10 PhD students and about 10 master's students.
Yeah.
And we said to them, you must collect information from different disciplines. So if they were ecologists or economists or social scientists, they should work in the same area at the same time and at the same scale.
Yes.
So that when they put their information together, they can match it up. And that worked very well. We also had an approach where we said to the PhD students, every one of you has to write one of the chapters in your thesis with another student from a different discipline.
Yes.
So they were forced to work with each other and combine their data. So for example, if an economist wanted to know what the invasions were costing, he would work with an ecologist to find out first what they were doing, what harm they were doing, and then he'd quantify that and then turn it into economic terms. So that was almost a unique approach. I don't think a study has been done like this anywhere before.
It's absolutely fascinating. I can also just believe that you guys had some significant findings. Are there any that stands out for you, specifically now thinking back?
Yeah, look, what's come out is that it's not an ecological problem. It's a social ecological problem. Yes. So it affects people as well as the ecology and conservation. And prosopis is what we call a conflict species. So some people like it because it has uses, and other people dislike it because it has disadvantages. So the people who make charcoal or use it for firewood or use the pods to feed their cattle, they see an advantage in having these. But everybody else suffers the consequences.
Yeah.
The injuries, the loss of water, the loss of grazing, the loss of biodiversity. And what's interesting is that perceptions change over time. So initially people perceive this as a good thing, but then as the impacts start to grow, more and more people perceive it as a negative thing. Yeah. The problem is that by the time they realize it's a negative thing, it's almost too late to stop it. So we've got to get people to understand that this thing it might look good in the beginning, but it's going to turn out generally bad. The other thing that we have established that this invasion in Eastern Africa is still at an early stage. It's invaded 10 million hectares, but it's going to invade much, much, much more. Yeah. And this says we've still got a chance to do something about it, but we have to stop it from spreading. And if we don't, the consequences are going to be quite serious.
Are there any specific areas where these trees like growing or like more than other areas where they grow?
Yes. They prefer very dry areas. So, in South Africa, for example, they hang out in the Northern Cape, which is our biggest province, but our least populated province because it's so dry. And it's in these areas that people need help with farming, and it's exactly there that those trees grow. So in places like northern Kenya, Ethiopia, southern Tanzania, Sudan, they are all relatively dry countries, and prosopis really thrives in those areas.
What would you say should be done to manage the situation?
Well, it's a difficult plant to control. You know, it's thorny. It forms these dense thickets. So once it's invaded an area, you can cut it down, but that takes a lot of effort.
Yeah.
And the two things that you should focus on right now is, rather than trying to control it where it occurs, try to stop it from spreading to new areas. That's the one thing that you should really focus on, or that the people in those regions should focus on. And the other thing is to bring in some biological control. So biological control is bringing in some insects from the native range of those plants from Central America and releasing them so that they can damage the plants and make them less invasive. This has been done in Australia.
Yeah.
And it's worked quite well there. But people are always very wary of biological control. And if I can say one thing, let me stress that biological control is really safe. The insects that are selected will not attack other plants. So the most common question that people ask us is, what happens when they've eaten all the prosopis trees? Are they going to start eating the other trees, the other crops and so on? And the answer is no. Because these insects are selected, they're highly specific. They will only attack the target tree and not others.
And just lastly, I think where we stand now, how urgently do you think steps should be taken? When should we start acting?
Right now. You know, with something like this that spreads, the longer you leave it, the more expensive it becomes.
Yes.
And if you leave it too long, it almost becomes not worth it to try and control it, because it will cost you more than it's worth. So, as I said, the invasion is at an early stage, and now is the time to act. And you know, I'm just hoping that this book will help to bring the message across to people. We paid a lot of money to have the book published as open access, so anybody can download the book free of charge from the internet, and the information is there. You know, otherwise these books can be very expensive and people just don't get the information that they need to have.
Well, thank you for your role that you're playing. We really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much.